Richard, why don't we start with a question about the development of philosophy of religion in the Anglophone world over the last half decade. In a previous conversation with Alvin Plantinga, we talked about how that scape changed in the United States. But there's also a story abroad. And I'd like you to describe, if you could, a little bit the difference of what it was like for you as a Christian and a philosopher between the time, say, when you were an undergraduate and the time you were in the early stages of your professorate.
Yes, I was an undergraduate and then immediately after that a graduate student at Oxford in the late 1950s. Philosophy in the English-speaking world, a kind of philosophy that's subsequently been named analytic philosophy, that kind of philosophy was going through a rather strange period. People in Oxford felt that philosophers of the past had built big metaphysical systems which didn't have much justification. And they thought that the task of philosophy was to sort out what we meant by a lot of general terms we used. What was it like? What is it to know something or to believe something? Or what is it for one thing to cause another? And of course, you also consider that, but the way you consider it was a bit different from the way that people in Oxford considered it in the 50s. For them, the task was simply to describe this in detail, the circumstances when somebody would be said to know that there are a lot of people in this room as opposed to believe it. And when they described how the word was used, they didn't ask the further question, well, was there something deep behind the use of the word that unified all these uses? They just catalogued the uses and that was that. And that was all rather strange because philosophers of the past, of any tradition, have tried to give a general description of what the world is like, a picture, a metaphysical picture of what things there are and how they interact, which may not be things that are invisible at all. Plato, who started Western philosophy, talked of the forms. The forms were immaterial entities which somehow determined how things on Earth behaved. Well, as I say, philosophy in Oxford in the 1950s was a pretty linguistic operation of showing you how we use these general terms and why there wasn't much point in building metaphysical pictures.
Who would you name as particular outstanding figures of that tradition?
Oh, especially when I was an undergraduate, J.L. Austin. I don't know how many people have read J.L. Austin these days, but he was a very sharp mind, but his task was a pretty limited one. And Gilbert Ryle, of course.
Did you have both of them as professors when you were a student?
Yes, both of those were professors at Oxford. When I was there, they weren't my individual tutors, but I used to go to J.L. Austin's classes quite a lot. At any rate, religion didn't have much part in all this. Philosophers weren't very interested in religion. They sort of thought it was things people did in church, and there wasn't any particular reason for doing these things. And so there wasn't a special subject in the philosophy of religion at all under the auspices of the philosophy faculty. The only way you could study it was as a rather esoteric special option under the theology faculty for an undergraduate degree. So there wasn't very much scope for studying it, though my professorship had been founded in the 1920s, and the then holder of it was Ian Ramsay, and he had a little influence. So I just learnt philosophy as it was done, and of course it did include some study quite a bit of study really, of the classical authors. And the classical authors tended to mean the British empiricists and the other writers of the 17th century, Descartes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Kant, and so on.
Was there, if I may interrupt just for a second, was there a sense that, I mean, all of those figures talk about God a lot. Was there any sense of a need for an excuse to explain why that part of their writings were just ignored?
Occasionally there was an analysis of or the particular logical mistakes they were believed to have made. Of all the great philosophers, of course, Hume was the person who most influenced that sort of style of philosophy. At any rate, there wasn't much scope for the philosophy of religion, but I saw that it was a discipline which did try and sort out concepts and made us very clear what we mean by it. And it seemed to me that it could be used for its more traditional, this discipline of expressing oneself very clearly and showing the relation between concepts and so on, what would be of great use for theology, which didn't seem to be at all interested in arguments for the existence of God or anything else.
And it seems clear that the way you've presented analytic philosophy, it's not a body of doctrine in any way, it's not a set of teachings, but simply a method of expression and a form of investigation.
Yes, but what has come to be called analytic philosophy later developed from what I described, but has become a very different discipline, because nowadays we're all building metaphysical systems and telling people what the world is like in ways they can't see and so on.
Can you give an example of the sort of thing you're talking about when you talk about philosophers building a metaphysical
system?
system?
I see. Well, many philosophers would see it as their task to state what are the ultimate constituents of the world, and of course a fashionable view is physicalism. The only things that exist are physical things, physical objects, which tend to be material objects such as that, and they have properties such as being brown, and many philosophers think that you could describe the world, all there is to be in the world is like that. And all the truths about the world are just truths about which physical objects are where and how they interact. But other philosophers are a bit more ambitious, and other philosophers think as well as that there are minds, and what is it to be a mind, and then we start on all the problems of whether a mind is a thing which interacts with the body, or saying something, someone has a mind is just talking about how they behave. And then, of course, there are further issues. It looks as if there's space and time, and is this a thing, and can you analyze the behavior of physical objects in terms of, in ways which don't involve talking about them having a place in space or continuing to exist through time. So what is space? What is time? And then, of course, we move on to God. Is it the case that beyond all this there is a God who keeps the world in being and perhaps intervenes in it sometime? And all these issues are now in a big way in play in philosophy in a way that they weren't back in the 1950s. And yet the discipline is continuous, and but it's, I think, rather misnamed as analytic philosophy, because in the 1950s people were analyzing. They were analyzing what the word meant, whereas these days it's difficult to think of them that they're doing any analyzing at all. They're building. I've just described metaphysics, but of course there is its sister project of epistemology. What can we know about the world? What sort of access to it? Back in the 1950s, they just catalogued the sort of things we'd be said to know and the sort of things we'd be said not to know, and thought that's the end of the task. But nowadays, there is a general project of describing what knowledge is, and so producing a general answer to what sort of things we can know. And of course, ethics has always been part of philosophy. Back in the 1950s, people tended to think, well, they asked, when do people say things are right or wrong? Well, let's catalogue this when they say things are right or wrong, and what's common to them well, they're just expressions of emotion or attitudes to things. They didn't ask the question of whether there are moral truths independent of these attitudes. But of course, we're all asking that now, and that's progress.
So you were saying that this method that's called analytic philosophy that you've just described, its evolution a little bit, you saw that it held some promise for application to theological issues and religious issues.
Yes.
Were you alone in that? I mean, did you feel like there were other people that idea was in the air at all, or did you feel like this was very much a
Wasn't
discovery?
It really wasn't very much in the air.
And what did you do once you had this
Oxford
thought?
philosophy those days, I've described what it does, but it regarded what it did as an orthodoxy. That's to say, if you stepped outside those lines, I mean, they were fair, you'd have to give a very good account of yourself. Otherwise, you would be slapped down. And, Ian Ramsay, who was professor at that time, he certainly had some sort of ambition to give religion a place in the view of the world, but he wasn't a philosopher by origin. He was a scientist who was also an Anglican priest.
But was he successful in getting some ideas and conversations going?
To some extent, yes, and more so when he was Basil Mitchell, who succeeded him, was originally before he had the professorship, he was a philosophy teacher at Oxford, and so he did come from the Oxford setup, and he was a bit more.
So what made Mitchell more effective than Ramsay? Was it primarily that he was?
He was recognizable by Oxford philosophers as someone who was a philosopher. But things moved on by a little by the time he became professor, which was in the late 1960s. But why should we call it all analytic philosophy? What characterizes analytic philosophy today? Well, it seems to me very rigorous argument, very much influenced by science and wanting to take account of science, very rigorous argument, asking the big questions about what there is and what we can know about it, but using very clear and rigorous ways of expressing things. And the clarity and rigor is certainly what is continuous with the philosophy of the 1950s. But asking the big questions is taking that clarity and rigor in a direction that those in the 1950s wouldn't have appreciated. But it all gets called analytic philosophy just because it's a development of that style of philosophy that was then current. But it's a funny name for it, and it's not a very good name for it, and it gets us misunderstood among people who don't do analytic philosophy. Right. They think, many people on the continent of Europe who are, of course, understandably not up to date with the latest things being done in the English-speaking world, tend to think that, these philosophers in the English-speaking world are just analyzing concepts. They're not doing the real work of metaphysics that we're doing. But of course that isn't the case.
I'd like to follow two rabbit trails from what you just said before we get back to the historical developments. One has to do with the relationship between science and religion. Many people who will be watching this, many of the people here present, have read some of your work on this subject. Could you give a very brief statement about how you see the relationship between religion and science, and then tell us a little bit about the difference between the way people would tend to think of that in the United Kingdom versus your experience of how people think of that in the United States?
I doubt if there's any difference between how sophisticated or well-educated people think about that relation in our two countries. There may be a difference about how less educated people think about it. Okay, my view. Well, science is a great activity. I spent the first 10 years of my philosophical career philosophizing about science, and that was the area I first specialized in. It's building a picture of how the physical world works, and to some extent, to some small extent, how it interacts with our thoughts and feelings. But basically, how the physical world works. And we understand, as a result of all the achievements of the past 500 years, how the table is really made of atoms and protons and neutrons and so on, which are interacting with each other. And we understand how visible things are made of very small things, and how visible things are part of a very large universe of which we can only see a very small part. It showed us what the physical world is like, and it showed us just how things interact in the physical world. And this has, of course, enabled us to make great technological advances. It's a great thing. But of course, it doesn't answer the fundamental question of why there is a world at all, and above all, of why things behave so regularly in the world. Why does each electron behave the same as each other electron? If you say, well, it's a matter of definition that it does, then the question then becomes, why are there only so few kinds of particles, electrons, neutrons, and so on, each of which behaves in exactly the same way as each other, and in many respects all of these particles behave in exactly the same way as every other particle, in, for example, that they are governed by, though that can be a rather misleading term, they conform to the laws of gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak forces which determine the interaction of particles. And this is a very remarkable thing, but of course science presupposes that. It doesn't ask the question why it is like that. And if you start asking that question, then the world becomes a lot stranger than it seems if you're just doing physics, because you learn that the world as we see it evolved from the Big Bang many billions of years ago, and it's only because the Big Bang had a very, very precise bang about it. It was only so far, just within one part or one part in a million of a certain value, that its explosion would lead to the evolution of human bodies, and it was only because the fundamental particles had just the values of mass and charge that they have that you would get this. And then I've mentioned the physical, but of course the great achievements of modern science have on the whole been achieved by what I may call siphoning off the mental. What I mean by that is people in the Middle Ages and Greek times would have thought of the brownness of the chair as just as much part of it as the shape of the chair or the mass of the chair. But since the 17th century, we've come to think of, well, the chair really has a mass and a certain shape and size, but the color is the effect of the shape of the surface of light rays reflected from the surface onto our eyes, which produce this effect. Now, science, by sort of ignoring all these secondary qualities, as they come to be called, not merely color, but smell and taste and sound and so on, has got a good picture of the physical world. But it's done that by thinking of the physical world as a lot less the kind of world we actually interact with. And therefore, once you do that, other questions arise, such as, okay, why does it look brown? Or rather, does it look brown to everybody in the same way? How do we know that things look the same to everybody else? If the brownness isn't there, but only an effect on us, how do we know it has the same effect on everybody? And similarly with issues of sound and so on. And so why does it produce this effect? Why is it shape and so on, something we can all see and observe, but nevertheless it has effects which we can't all see and observe, which are different in each person, and this raises big issues. So yes, science is a great thing, physical science, but look at it a bit more closely. Why is the world like that, and what about the parts of the world it's not dealing with? And yes, philosophy's got a lot of work to do.
So what I hear you saying is that science points beyond itself in two ways. It points beyond itself by following a path down to a sort of either backwards or downwards in explanation to features it cannot itself explain,
Yes.
because they are the fundamental postulates of assumption.
Yes.
And then also just in virtue of the fact that there are parts that it ignores. There's more than what it talks about.
Yes.
So I want to go back to the first one, about when you talked about the fine-tuning of,
Yes.
of the world. What do you say to people who say, well, that's true, but there could have been an infinite number of universes, each one of them holding every possible combination of proportions, so that we were bound to get at least one of them with a universe like our own, or you can make it a single universe that repeats until you get
Yes,
until it gets it right.
And as many of you will know, this is the theory of the multiverse, that our universe is just one of many. But there are different kinds of multiverse theories, and respectable scientists, respectable physicists are only really prepared to endorse as a serious possibility what I might call the narrow theory of the multiverse. And the narrow theory of the multiverse just says that okay, everything within whatever it is, so and so many trillion miles of us is what we call our universe. But out there, a lot more trillions of miles away, there's another collection of stars and planets and so on, and these possibly infinite in different directions, but anyway, they're all part of the same spatio-temporal realm. And yes, it's possible that the laws are such. All this is from a physics point of view, pretty speculative, but it may well be that the laws of nature are such that all of these evolved from the Big Bang, but the Big Bang tended to produce laws. That is to say, once upon a time there was only one law, but when you get matter cooling down, there are different sorts of ways it can behave in, and it behaves in one way in our universe, and we describe that by saying there are one set of laws here, and a different way in a different universe. But the only kind of multiverse you could possibly have any evidence for would be one in which the simplest account of the laws of our universe led us to suppose that there were more general laws which operated and crystallized out to more particular laws in different places, and the more particularity of the laws would consist in there being different constants. What I mean by that is take the gravitational example, objects attract each other with a certain force in our universe. Well, perhaps in another universe they attract each other a lot stronger or a lot weaker. Well, that's possible. But then all of these, the assumption is that the same very general laws operate throughout the multiverse. That is to say, the laws of quantum theory, the laws of relativity theory, and a much more general law determining how the gravitational force and so on crystallize out in different universes. So there must be a law, indeed, quite a number of laws of the multiverse, and then the same question arises. Why are the laws of this form that quantum theory describes, or relativity describes, or why is the constant of those laws such as to lead to these constants? And once again, the problem re-arises in this form. Well, of course, there have been some highly speculative theories, of which the best known is a physicist called Max Tegmark, who has postulated that every kind of possible universe with every kind of possible law that there ever has been has exists somewhere. But that's just pure speculation, not merely for which you don't have evidence, but which you can't have evidence, because you can only have evidence of something that makes a difference to something you can observe. And if they're in a different space, let alone a different time, there are no being in a different space just means that there are no causal roots from there to us. So it's all so pure speculation.
Yeah. So clearly, you don't think the multiverse reply to the data point of the particularity of the world's ensemble is very promising. I wonder if you think there is what is the most promising line of reply the atheist has to the sorts of arguments from science for God that you've discussed? What is the best the atheist can do, in your opinion?
Well, I don't think he can do anything as regards the argument that this sort of universe or this sort of multiverse is the sort of universe that a God who is interested in producing good things, and we're a good thing, would produce. But of course, religion is not just a matter of postulating a God who sustains the universe. All the great religions, including Christianity, suppose that he interacts with the universe. He answers our prayers occasionally, at any rate. And of course, Christianity believes that he became incarnate, he came to earth himself. So it postulates an interaction. And if science were to show, well, the world is a totally deterministic place, then that would show there was no scope for his interaction. It would still allow that he might have made it in the beginning or kept it like that from eternity, but it wouldn't leave any scope for him to intervene. I happen to have arguments to show that that couldn't possibly be established, but those arguments are, of course, a little more contentious than what I've said at the moment. At the moment,
Well,
I think any scientist is going to admit, well, there is a problem about why there's a universe, why, above all, things behave regularly, and
So
that lies outside his scope of.
Yeah. So the scientist, the atheist who wants to claim the mantle of science seems to be up against a dead end there. Let's go back now to the story of the development of philosophy of religion in the Anglophone world. So where we left off, you had come to the realization that the methods that we now call those of analytic philosophy had something to offer those who wanted to clarify and defend doctrines in the Christian
Yes.
religion. How did you first start to put that idea into action, and did you face any sort of negative feedback or obstacles or hurdles in your attempt to do that?
Well, I decided to read the BPhil, that's the 2-year graduate program, which was all that was necessary at those days in order to become a professional philosopher, because I thought that philosophy could help. But then I also, and I did a diploma in theology because I thought that's what it could help with. But I also thought that the paradigm of knowledge in the modern world was science. And this was not realized by philosophers in the Anglo-American world who are charting linguistic usage. They weren't very interested, at least in the Anglo-American world. Now here there is a difference. It wasn't of interest to philosophers in Oxford, partly because for almost all of them their background was in the classics, and science was a bit out of their depth. But when I became convinced that it was science that was very important, not necessarily because it gave us true answers, but because people thought its methods were the methods that would eventually get the true answers. And I realized I didn't know much science. So I was lucky enough to have a couple of research fellowships, and I devoted those largely to learning some science, and above all learning the history of science as to why scientists had come to refer this theory to that theory to the other.
So the first step was just to educate yourself,
Yes.
not just in philosophy, but in theology and science.
Yes.
To become knowledgeable in all of those disciplines.
But then I devoted the first 10 years roughly of my philosophical career to philosophizing about science. My first book was called Space and Time, and as the name indicates, it's about what is space and what is time and what we can know about it. Yes, and in particular, it was an examination of the relevance of the theory of relativity to our understanding of these matters. As some of you know, I mean, theory of relativity, for example, it tells us that all measurements of space and time are relative to a certain frame of reference, and there isn't a truth about how far A is from B. There's only a truth about how far A is from B if you measure it in one way or if you measure it in another. Well, that's an interesting contention, and it's the sort of thing philosophers can get to work on, as it were. Why would one think that? And are the reasons good enough? And what does this show us about the general nature of things? So yes, and although I did then write a rather small book about miracles, because someone asked me to, my next big book was also really on the philosophy of science. It was about probability, about the theory of probability understood as, and there are different ways of understanding probability, but what's now come to be called epistemic or inductive probability, it was a book about how the calculus of probability can be used to measure the probability of different sorts of theories. And
just in a perfectly general way that applied
yes,
across the board
that's
in
right.
philosophy
It was
of
called
science.
An Introduction to Confirmation Theory. That's what it.
So you've got two major works in your first decade of service in foundational issues
Yes.
in the philosophy of science. So then you decide you want to write something specifically in philosophy of religion.
Yes, that's right.
How was that? How did you obtain a contract for that? How was it received initially? And did people try to discourage you from doing that?
No, but by then I'd moved up the philosophical ladder a bit, as it were, as a result of my books. And philosophy itself was beginning to change.
This is an important thing I want to underscore, is that you didn't start out by saying, here are my thoughts about God. You first earned the hearing by doing hard work in the foundational issues of philosophy of science, so that people would then listen to what you had to say about the religion part.
Yes, that's not the only reason why I went into science. I thought science had something to teach me, as it were.
Right, of course.
Understanding science would help me to understand religion. But yes, of course, it did have that crucial advantage that people were able to respect me as someone who
Took
did the same
seriously and
activity as
understood
they
the
did,
scientific
and
tradition itself.
also philosophers were beginning to realize that science was rather important for philosophy. So at that stage, my activity in the philosophy of science was philosophically appreciated. And I say philosophy itself was beginning to change. This ordinary language philosophy, as it's being called, in the 1950s was disappearing, and people were moving back to examining the big general questions which philosophy has always been interested in.
And you think
And
that helped sort of pave the way for you to ask this bigger question
yes,
about?
certainly,
Okay.
yes. And then, well, I wrote the books on the philosophy of religion, and I asked the questions, which, after all, the questions were the ones the medievals, well, everybody had been asking in philosophy ever since the Greeks, but above all, the medievals had developed pretty sophisticated discussions about.
And people who are familiar with medieval philosophy know that, but the phrase medieval can also be used as a pejorative.
Oh, indeed,
and,
yes.
I imagine in the 60s and 70s,
Oh,
that's
that-
medieval wasn't always a compliment.
No, no,
So how
indeed
did how did you face the
Oh,
the
yes.
challenge?
Well,
of-
I mean, although I am just saying, sure, there was a lot of mention in the footnotes of Aquinas and so on, but I wasn't doing a study of medieval philosophy. I was asking the big questions from the beginning. And the first big book I wrote was called The Coherence of Theism, and that was an examination of what theists, people who believe there's a God, meant by what they were claiming by their claim that there is a God. And which of those, and you can spell that out in different ways, and so it was an examination of which of those ways of talking about God were coherent, that is to say, didn't involve contradictions, and which did. And the first part of that book was an examination of religious language. It's always been said that religious language, people who talk about God have to use words in somewhat unusual senses compared to their normal senses, analogical or metaphorical senses. So it was an examination of how analogy works, and then it applied it to all the things we believe about God, that he's omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, and so on.
So again, when you start your career shift phase from philosophy of science to philosophy of religion, for the most part, you start again with foundational issues,
Always, yes.
and to build upon. Now, in a moment, I want to bring the interview to a close by asking you to address what you think are the most pressing concerns for philosophy of religion over the next few decades. But first, I want to talk about a particular issue of the application of philosophy of religion, application of philosophy of science, and especially confirmation theory to philosophy of religion, that sometimes comes up. So you wrote a book about defending the historicity of the resurrection
Yes.
of Jesus from the dead, and you assign a particular probability, and that is upwards of 0.97 something or other.
That is, if you look at the text, I don't quite say that. Some people believe I have said that.
It's often said that you said that.
Yes. What I said is
I'm
that
giving you a chance to clarify.
the probability of the resurrection on the evidence which I described is very high. And I illustrated this point by a formal appendix. The book didn't use any of the probability calculus, but I put the calculus in the appendix. And what I said was there, if we make certain assumptions, for which I'd argued, of course, about how probable it is that there is a God, and how probable, if there is a God, that he would interfere in history, and how probable it would be that he would interfere in this way, and how probable it would be that you would get this. Well, anyway, there were a number of assumptions. I said it, and I gave very artificial values to these. If you suppose this is a half, and you suppose this is 0.01, and so on. Artificial values which were justified by the text, in which I said, well, this is as likely as not, so I gave it the exact value of a half. Or this is very improbable, so I gave it the exact value of 0.01.
So the numbers are just there to represent judgments
if you make all those assumptions, then it comes out that the probability of the resurrection is 0.97. And I ended that by saying, if anybody doesn't agree with that, then they must disagree with one of the assumptions, and they must justify a different, not just a different exact value, but a very different exact value.
So they would have to either suggest a different method, or they would have to suggest their own numbers to plug into the calculus, and then the onus is on them to defend those numbers.
But of course this got well misrepresented. Especially on the net, actually, where somebody who
that's one reason why we're setting the record straight today.
Thought he would be doing me a service by putting on the net the arguments which he thought I had produced in this book, including the premise which he thought I was relying on, that if you have a proposition P and didn't know anything about the evidence for it, for all propositions P, the probability of P and the probability of not P would be the same. And that does, if you assume that holds for all propositions, this leads to immediate contradictions and so on, but I wasn't in fact relying on that. But he thought I would, and he put this in and pointed out how I reached this conclusion of 97%. But I don't know who the person was that put this on the net, so I had no means of contacting him. But
you heard it here. That is not his view.
But a lot of people then put stuff on the net saying how absurd it is that a professor of philosophy at Oxford should be saying this sort of thing. And it did me no good.
So one final, more general question before we get to your talk about the future. What about people who just say, look, science is a good thing, it's great, but it's just a totally different thing. It's inappropriate to apply anything that could be given numbers, whether artificial or provisional or otherwise, to matters of religion. People who say they're just so fundamentally different that it's misguided to apply methods that you've taken from the philosophy of science to propositions about religion or to the phenomenon of religion itself that scientific methods simply don't apply. It's wrong-headed from the very beginning.
Well, a lot of people have said that in the last 200 years. A lot less people said it before then. Arguments for the existence of God, which depended on principles which we could recognize in other fields, has always been part of the Christian worldview. Christian thinkers, there are exceptions of course, but in general up till 1800, Christian thinkers thought most people don't need arguments because they have religious experience or they have the teaching of the church. But some people do need arguments, and they can be given. And if you
So there's a division. There's just some people have a direct evidence of God's existence and of the religious truth. Some people accept it wisely on the testimony of others.
Yep.
And then for the other category, the idea was
Yes,
just, as if I
indeed.
hear you right, the arguments are available for the people who need them.
That is the view of, well, I could name a number of famous theologians through the centuries, but I mean,
the standard view.
Gregory of Nyssa, who was a very influential 4th century theologian, said, when you're arguing with anybody, you have to start from where they are. And if you're arguing with a Jew about the existence of God, oh no, you wouldn't do that, but about particular Christian doctrines, you would start from the Old Testament. Or if you're arguing with somebody else, you would start from somebody else. But if you're arguing with an atheist, and he clearly thought that was also part of the thing you did, you would start from the regularity and beneficial nature of the world in which we lived. And you would say that because it was a good place to live and well designed, that suggests that it had a good designer. Now, that's a fairly quick argument compared with some of the things we
But
give.
it shows the continuity in thought.
Yes, that's right.
From
And
then
they all
present.
dated back, when sort of asked to provide justification, to St. Paul, who said in the beginning of the letter to the Romans, pagans are without excuse for not worshipping one God, because the things of God can be seen from the visible world. And another passage in the Acts of the Apostles, he said God has provided evidence for them, I always forget the exact words, but in the bounty of the world or something. For the first 1,000 years of Christianity, you don't get more than maximum 10 pages in the writing of a theologian about these matters, simply because the people they were arguing with on the whole believed there was a God. They were arguing about other matters. But you get quite a long passage, for example, in St. Athanasius, whom some of you may have heard of for his vigorous defense of the Incarnation, but there's about 10 pages of argument, which is really an argument from fine-tuning, actually, because he thought, as everybody thought then, there were 4 sorts of stuff out of which the world was made: earth, air, fire, and water. And earth tended to tend to the center of the world, and then water tended to form a sphere around that, or would under its natural powers. But of course, he says, when you look at the world, clearly the visible things we see have been made of earth, air, fire, and water in such a complex way that they don't fall, so that the earthy parts don't fall immediately to the ground and the fiery parts push up to the heavens. And
So it has the same structure as
yes,
the
that's
argument
right.
you gave before from modern physics.
Yes.
So, there's, and we can post those passages actually online under the video. So you've demonstrated a remarkable continuity in thought throughout the Christian tradition.
Yes, up till 1800.
When things went crazy.
Partly due to Kant.
We don't have time to hear what happened then. So let's take that story that brings us up to present, skipping over the bit about Kant for a different video, and share with us your thoughts about the prospects of philosophy of religion in the future, and the challenges it might face and the issues it should take up over the next several decades?
Yes, well, very briefly, taking the story beyond the coherence of theism, which was when philosophy of religion got going, as it were, in the Anglo-American world, as I was saying, partly because philosophy itself began interested in deep questions, and partly because, not just me, but various people, but mostly people in the United States, like Alvin Plantinga and Nick Wolterstorff, who taught in philosophy departments, they argued about religion with exactly the same categories and ways of assessing arguments as people were using in other areas of philosophy in their philosophy departments, and therefore they were respected for that. And the first questions being asked is, did it make sense to say there was a God? And to answer that, you have to say, well, what it means to be omnipotent, omniscient, and that what I describe my book as doing. Innumerable people have made things more complicated and sophisticated since. And then the question is, well, is it true that there's a God? And then people began to give arguments for the existence of God, or to say we didn't need arguments, okay? And then they've begun to look at particular doctrines of particular religions about God, inevitably because of where this activity grew up. They've focused largely on Christianity, but some people have worked on Judaism or Islam. And the question is, what does it mean to say God is three persons in one substance, or can you justify it? And then the next question is, okay, well, you've shown it means something, well, can you give any reason to suppose it's true? And all these, the latter activities, there have been rather less of than the former activities in the philosophy of religion, and I hope that there'll be a lot more work in these Christian doctrine areas. But then philosophy of religion is closely connected, as my earlier remarks implied, with one's views about us, about the nature of human beings. And this means that all the work being done in any area of philosophy is crucially relevant, but above all in the philosophy of mind, in the relation between mind and body, and about whether we have free will. If we are simply bodies, then it's difficult to see how we can come to life again in the general resurrection if all the matter of which we are made is burnt in the crematorium. But if the crucial part of us is the soul, then clearly it can be given a new body in the resurrection. So issues about how is the mind related to the body, and whether we have free will also are crucial for the philosophy of religion, and a lot of work will continue to be done in these areas. But there are other things that we must pay attention to. One issue very prominent in the United States, as in other countries to an extent, is the relation between church and state. That is to say, what is the right attitude of religious people to the state, and what the right limits to the state's, whether the state can interfere with religious practice. But another issue which I do think people in the philosophy of religion ought to concentrate on is issues in which Christian views about what actions are moral differ from non-Christian views about what actions are moral. There weren't the kinds of differences there are now. Didn't really exist before the 19th century. And what I have in mind is views about sex and views about the beginning and end of life. On issues like euthanasia, abortion, suicide, and issues about sex, about homosexuality, divorce. There are a number of issues on which the secular world and the Christian world have different views. And so far, those interested in the philosophy of religion haven't looked very closely at these issues. I think they found them very toxic to discuss. But nevertheless, they'd better look at them from both points of view, because if Christianity has got this wrong, then it ought to say so, and it ought to explain why that doesn't affect its general justification. On the other hand, if Christianity's got this right, then it ought to explain why it's right. And this is a typical work for philosophers to do, because it's a work of ethics, and a lot of philosophical work takes place in the area of ethics, particularly practical ethics, and there's a lot of need for that to be done. I'm sure other areas beyond this will emerge, but when I'm asked about what are the prospects and so on, I usually decline to answer beyond any immediate prospects on the grounds that humans have free will, and it's up to us to decide where we're going to take things.
I was wondering, you talked about science, and you said that science is a discipline where people were looking for answers in philosophy. And I was wondering if science is still a discipline where people are looking over there.
Sorry, I didn't hear you very clearly.
I'll restate them, Richard.
It's probably an accent problem.
Okay. You talked about earlier, you talked about how science was the discipline to which people in philosophy were looking for answers.
People in the wider world were looking. Everybody outside the narrow philosophical clique in Oxford in the 1950s were beginning to think as they do now. If you want an answer to a question, ask the relevant scientist. Yeah.
So my question was, I think that you answered it, is that where people are still looking? Or
Yes. Well, that's my guess. I mean, your guess is a guess, or you're as well equipped as I am to know how the world is thinking. But I think that's how the world is thinking.
Any other undergrads? Yes, go ahead.
So I have a qualm with you on your mental events argument. So I think that there are two facets to it. First, using an inference to the best explanation, wouldn't it be more probable that if the mind was split into two people or split into two bodies, wouldn't it be more probable, since we know that the personality continues to exist, that it would exist in both bodies rather than any of your other explanations? And further, isn't it possible that animals beyond those of higher beings, such as ants perhaps, would have a similar process where they might too have mental events?
Okay, this raises an argument that may not be familiar to everyone here,
Right.
but I could
And,
put it...
and I certainly invite you to stick around after and follow up
Well,
with a more
I think I
detailed
can
answer.
explain very
Yeah, but we do
quickly.
need to,
Yeah.
probably not in the time frame that he needs, but go ahead and give it a shot.
Yeah. We've got, our brain consists of two hemispheres, a left and a right hemisphere, and the brainstem. I ask the question, suppose the scientists of the future, but I mean the science are getting near to this point, can take out our whole brain out of our skull and divide it into two. The hemispheres to some extent duplicate each other, that's to say they do similar function from each other, so the information which determines to some extent our personality is to a considerable extent contained in both hemispheres. Now suppose they take that out and put one hemisphere in one, take your take your brain out of your skull and give you half of mine, and take your brain out of your skull, give you half of mine, and suppose that's not enough for a functioning brain, so take a few further bits from my clone or my twin so that they fit this brain and put them in there and start it up. Presumably there will be two conscious beings, and presumably they will both have the somewhat similar attitude to life and somewhat similar claims about the past. But they can't both be me, because if something's me and having thoughts, I will be aware of those thoughts. And this one will not be aware of those thoughts, or that one will not be aware of those thoughts, so they can't both be me. Why do I deploy this? Well, the point is to show that we can know absolutely everything about what's happening to a brain, and absolutely everything about what thoughts and feelings individuals who have such a brain are thinking, and yet not know what has happened to me, not know who is that person, which shows that being that person, shows, I think, being that person is not a matter of having this brain or having this personality. It's something further and beyond that. to which we give the name soul. You couldn't describe what's happened in this experiment, which will certainly be done one day, alas. You couldn't describe what will happen unless you think there's more to me than my body. That's the point of it. Now, your question was, couldn't this be the case with animals? Well, I think it would be the case with any animal who was conscious, and I don't know, nobody knows just how far down the level of evolution consciousness occurs. I mean, we all think dogs and cats are conscious, rightly so. Are fish conscious? Probably. Are ants conscious? I'm inclined to think no. Reason for thinking that is they have a quite different brain structure from us and consciousness. At any rate, wherever there's conscious beings, the same argument would apply. Now, you had first, I've answered the second part of your question. There was a first part.
So I argued that we can clearly know that we can't say which one of the two of us have survived, have you survived in. So we can't know that, so that dismisses the argument that it could be either of us. And we know that your memories continue to live on. And so it can't be, couldn't have died in that process, so it can't be neither of us. And so, my question was, through that inference, the best explanation, wouldn't it stand to reason that both, it seems to me at least that the argument that both continue to hold on to your original soul is stronger.
Well, they can't both be me, and if what the argument is designed to show is that there must be a further part which makes me me, and that further part may go that way or it may go that way.
So he's got a foundational view that nothing is me if I can't have access to its thoughts. And so it just follows from that they can't both be you. Now, in my book, The Problem of Animal Pain, I actually argue for they're both me view. But the difference would be to this more fundamental issue. Adam?
Thank you for being here, Dr. Swinburne. I'm wondering if you could enlarge on the story that you started to tell about what went wrong in 1800.
Well,
well, I'll give you a quick answer.
you don't have to give the whole 200 years.
No. A major influence was Kant, and you will find on the continent of Europe, it's declining, but if you go to France and produce these arguments, they look puzzled and they say, look, Kant settled all that. Kant showed that there couldn't be any natural theology, any argument for the existence of God. And Kant's discussion in the Critique of Pure Reason, he argues that there cannot be any arguments of any cogency for the existence of God. Now, I think most philosophers in the English-speaking world think these are not very strong arguments, and in fact that there are fallacies in them at every stage, in my view. But that was not a common view on the continent of Europe after 1800. Now, it's not just Kant who is responsible, of course. Another influence, more prominent in England and no doubt in America, was Hume. And Hume also said there couldn't be a good argument, or that there weren't any good arguments. And he didn't have nearly as strong a view as Kant on this possibility. But between them, they clouded the philosophical world. And then Darwin came along with his theory of evolution by natural selection, which seemed to suggest that, God couldn't have made human beings because human beings were made by this process from the Big Bang. But of course, the question is, God didn't make us directly, but then wouldn't he be a greater God if instead of making machines, he made a machine-making machine, and so he didn't need to make particular machines? So, I mean, there's no real force in Darwin's argument, but still, a lot of people thought there were, and these three factors were very influential, as well as, I should say, of course, people believed that the book of Genesis should be taken very literally, If you take it literally, then once you take a lot of other figures in the Old Testament pretty literally, you get the result that the Earth came into existence in approximately 4000 BC. But then, of course, science revealed it didn't. Now, I have reason to believe that a lot of the Christian fathers who talked about how you should interpret the Old Testament said that you should interpret it in the light of other things you knew about God. Augustine said this very clearly, and because there were parts of the Old Testament which not merely didn't fit us, but didn't fit the current Greek thinking about the nature of the world. And on some particular issue, I mean, you know, the Old Testament pictures the world as flat, or some of it does, and the Greeks pictured it as spherical. But on one of these issues, Augustine said, okay, Greek science seemed to see this, and it doesn't look as that fits very well with the Old Testament. And if it should be shown that Greek science had got this right, then we would need to suppose that God was talking to us metaphorically when he inspired the book of Genesis. Now, a lot of people, when the 19th century came along, read Scripture in a more literal way than it had ever been read before, and therefore there was this big clash. So all between all these facts were at work.
Very nice. So we have time for at least two more questions. Allie?
So you mentioned that studying Christian morals is sort of the next frontier in philosophy of
Yeah.
religion. And I'm wondering if you think that what the sort of unique aspects of Christian morals are that separate them from secular morals is the deliverance of revelation or something like that. Why do you think that that's in the purview of philosophy of religion?
Well, there are two separate questions here, really, or rather I'm going to give you a two-part answer. Firstly, it is an issue about, Christian religion says God has revealed these things. Okay, I'm happy with that, but the issue is how are we to know that he has revealed these things? And this becomes a philosophical question of what is the grounds for supposing that a revelation has occurred. And inevitably that is going to depend, the answer to it is going to depend on what you think has been revealed, and that will depend on how you interpret the text. So it's a further question, why should we suppose that the text ought to be interpreted in this way? All of this raises arguments about how we can know that this is what the text or the church which Christ founded, that is central to the revealed message. And then, but one criterion for whether it's central to the revealed message can't simply be on the basis of those kinds of considerations, but also, is it the sort of thing that a good God would have told us? Would a good God have forbidden suicide? Would a good God have forbidden abortion? Would a good God have forbidden homosexual acts? And that's an immediate philosophical question. Is it compatible with the goodness of God that he should want us to do this rather than that? And once again, there's a straight moral issue there.
Blake?
Yes, so I have an epistemological question. So say you're a Christian and you're inquiring into some issue, just for the sake of convenience, let's talk about God's foreknowledge. And it seems very traditionally held, maybe not dogmatically, but certainly near and dear to the Christian tradition that God foreknows future actions. But then as you do the metaphysics, certain controversial views in time or in causation, things like this, you can't reconcile God's foreknowledge of free human actions.
Yeah.
what do you do? I know what you've done, but what advice do you give there? Do you say, well, I shouldn't expect necessarily to be able to reconcile these things? Maybe I'm not creative enough to know the answer. Not that there isn't an answer, but just that we need more time to figure it out. And do you hold on to that traditional Christian doctrine, or do you get rid of the Christian doctrine and say these metaphysical theses are strong enough that they should lead me to revise my Christian view?
Well, as in all matters, if there are a lot of arguments on one side and a lot of arguments on the other, you should yield to the strongest ones, whatever they are. But filling that out a little more generally, there is no incompatibility between believing that there is a God and believing that it's a necessary truth that no one can foresee the future. It wouldn't then be a limitation on God that he couldn't foresee the future, because no one has supposed that a God who is omnipotent could be expected to make me exist and not exist at the same time. I mean, clearly you have, when you say God is omnipotent, you have to spell out just what that means in terms of him only being able to do what's logically possible. And similarly with omniscience, I think, though this was well recognized for omnipotence long ago, and it's not recognized really for omniscience. But it would seem by parallel argument that it ought to be recognized for omniscience. That is to say that omniscience can't be construed as knowledge of everything, but only of what's logically possible to know. So if all you're doing is believing in a God, there doesn't seem to be any problem. Why the problem tends to arise, as you described it, is because the Christian tradition has normally supposed that a God does know our future free actions, or rather, to be a little more sophisticated, that God is outside time and timelessly knows our future free actions. Now, the question then is this an item of revelation which is central to the Christian tradition, such that if we give it up, we give up Christianity, or is it something peripheral that's rather attached and not important to the message? Well, as regards the timelessness of God, that has never been an item of doctrine in any, certainly not in Catholic or Orthodox or some Protestant traditions. As regards God's foreknowledge, or possibly more accurately, timeless omniscience, that too has never been an item until, for the Catholic tradition, the First Vatican Council in 1870 did say that God foreknows our future free actions. It always puzzled me why it said that, because that was not what it was its main business was, as it were. But anyway, it did say that. But on the other hand, it did not pronounce any anathemas, that is, defining as heretical the contrary view. It pronounced anathemas against all sorts of views, but it didn't pronounce anathema against that. So it would be a doubtful matter whether even the Catholic tradition has adopted that as a central item of its views. But you're right, almost all, but not entirely all, theologians over the past 2,000 years have tended to believe that. But there are exceptions, actually, interesting exceptions, and I don't think Jerome believed that, for example, one of the very influential doctors of the Church. But as regards Scripture, if you just look at, there are quite a lot of passages there that clearly imply that he doesn't know the future. Well, just to mention one, the book of Jonah. Jonah, you will remember, was told to preach to Nineveh, in 60 days you will be destroyed. So he did. But people repented, and therefore God didn't destroy them. And Jonah was very knocked about this. And God said to him, look, isn't it better that it wasn't necessary? Now, that Jonah was told by God to preach that this is going to happen. And he did, and God wouldn't have said that if he really thought it wasn't going to happen. So here seems to be a clear case where God didn't know what was going to happen in the future, because he didn't know how people would exercise their free will. And there are various other passages there, but the subsequent Christian tradition has generally said these passages should be not interpreted literally. But anyway, my view is this is not central to the Christian position.